authority, strength. I guess, biggest the position of authority.
I'd say power is the amount of influence you have over another person or another thing.
I think power is the influence that you have over other people. So like, the only power that exists is what you can get other people to do, whether that's through coercion or through buying them off or through exercising power and making them afraid of what you'll do to them if they don't do it. Yeah, that's what I think power is.
Strength, super speed, Batman, Superman.
Power could be described as something that when you have momentum and you have something that comes together to make change happen, some type of force has to happen. I think partly could be described as power.
Power is the ability to move the unmovable, whether it be a mountain or the human heart.
Power is a concept that is difficult to grasp or define, but it is a concept nonetheless that mankind has mutually respected throughout history. Power could be referring to people placed in positions of leadership, such as our president or members within our Congress. Power can also be seen in nature, through ocean waves smacking against the seashore, enormous volcanic eruptions that send rock and ash into the air and send rivers of hot lava down to melt away anything in its path. Power can be seen within a thunderstorm, hurricane, or tornado. Power is sometimes presented in negative or destructive ways, such as through natural disasters and corrupt or oppressive world leaders. Some people placed in positions of power act justly and accept the role of power that they have been given with pure motives. Others, however, abuse power once it is given to them and act out of impulse, causing prejudice, racism, and hatred to stem. These rash decisions made because of flawed character and judgment often lead to very devastating outcomes, such as terrorism. When many of us hear the word power, our mind has a preconceived image or narrative that we automatically think about, whether that be strength, oppression, fear, or wisdom. Some people might define power as being these things, but these are just a few aspects of power. Many of the words that people associate to power suggest that the only way to be considered powerful is to dominate. The more people underneath us, the more powerful we are. But in reality, power can also be expressed in smaller things, such as a father disciplining his child, or a mother giving birth and nurturing her newborn baby. Power can be a man dying on a cross and humiliating himself in front of thousands so that God may express his power by showing grace to a broken world through the sacrifice of his good and perfect Son. When we read about Jesus dissuading the teachers of the law and Pharisees from stoning the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8, it appears as though Jesus is refraining from using the power he has been given to judge and condemn this woman. But couldn't the grace and mercy that he shows to her also be considered power? It isn't always the biggest, strongest, or most dominant actions that display power, but rather small, humble acts of grace and love that are the most powerful and pertinent to our lives. When thinking about the power of God, we must cast aside our own understanding, because we have a hard time not viewing the deity of God through our own worldly lens. Power can also be presented humbly, as seen through the life of Jesus. God does come in wrath and anger. He does condemn and convict, and ultimately displays his power in very strong and fearful ways. But we must not forget that while God does display his power through strength, he also displays it very delicately through a still, small voice. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about various aspects of power that are found only in Christ. These aspects, or different facets of power, however, are expressed in very radical ways that are much different than what we are used to.
In a world that believes power comes from strength, financial prosperity, and knowledge, the Bible has an interesting perspective that we not only believe is contrary to popular opinions about power, but is also absolute truth. The letter of 1 Corinthians is Paul's attempt to show the Corinthians that they have the wrong understanding of who God is and his power, inevitably making them spiritually inept while they thought that they were the best of the best in the believing world. What the Corinthians failed to understand is that their knowledge of earthly subjects, their wealth, and their influence has no bearing in the light of the cross. What Jesus did as a humble servant is what exemplifies true power. Jesus exemplified power by humbling himself below others and leaning into God's strength. Paul first capitalizes on the difference between earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. As he speaks to the Corinthians, he says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God." What Paul is trying to communicate is this: when we comprehend, accept, and appreciate the message of the cross, it enables us to do more than we could have ever imagined was possible, and our power is no longer found in anything of this world, but strictly in God alone. For many of the Corinthians, they thought that the message of the cross was foolish. Verses 20 through 21 says, "Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe." What is seen by the Corinthians as foolishness is actually true wisdom in the eyes of God. Those who are foolish enough to believe in Christ are the ones who are truly wise. Paul mentions the Jews and the Greeks who demand signs, wonders, and wisdom for power. However, believers who preach Christ crucified are the ones who understand that Christ is the power and wisdom of God, not signs and wonders. Verse 25 says, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." This summarizes what Paul believes is true wisdom and power. This should serve to the Corinthians as a reminder that anything they have knowledge of or possess is still not good enough to measure up to what God's minimal amount of power can accomplish. Paul then appeals to the Corinthians a series of conflicting views about God's method of giving merit to what is powerful. Verse 27 says, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." Paul concludes by giving the Corinthians his personal testimony. He says, "When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence of human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power." Now, the Corinthians were pretty intelligent people, and they were accustomed to hearing speakers as elaborate language and lofty thoughts. To hear someone speak so plainly was probably trite. But Paul knew that through God's power, his weaknesses, fears, and lack of knowledge would still provide a fulfilling message because it was all about Christ crucified. Paul's words should set an example for and encourage those who believe. It is an example in the way that it shows that when believers make an attempt to do anything other than rely on God's power, they are more than likely going to fail because the world cannot provide the kind of power that changes lives. However, believers can be encouraged because when they accept who they are in Christ, preach his gospel truth, and lean into him in the midst of weakness, there will be things accomplished that were never considered possible. For those who do not believe, this should be an even greater comfort as the text concludes that a person does not have to be perfect or skilled, or rich, or the most intelligent in the world in order to be loved and used by God. In fact, being the complete opposite of those things puts people in a great position to be used by God as they find their strength, identity, and wisdom in Him. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 9. However, as it is written, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love Him.